Frederick Douglass once said that knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. What he discovered would change his life forever because he realized that the real prison was not chains, but ignorance. Today, we turn our attention to the life of Frederick Douglass and why he is one of the most powerful examples of self-transformation in history. He was born into slavery in 1818, at a time when millions lived and died without ever learning to read or write. Education was forbidden to enslaved people because knowledge was seen as dangerous, and Frederick Douglass would soon discover why. As a young boy, Douglass was sent to live in Baltimore, where he encountered something that would change the course of his life forever. He saw letters, words, books. At first, they meant nothing to him, but he became fascinated by them, and he began to learn the alphabet. When the man who enslaved him discovered that Douglass was being taught to read, he became angry and said something that Douglass would never forget. He said that if a slave learned to read, he would become impossible to control. In that moment, Frederick Douglass realized something profound. Education was not just about reading words. Education was about freedom. From that day forward, Douglass made a decision that would define his entire life. He would learn to read, no matter the cost. He taught himself in secret. He traded bread to poor children in exchange for reading lessons. He studied every book he could find. And as his knowledge grew, so did something else. He began to understand the world around him. He began to understand injustice. He began to understand his own condition. But this knowledge came with a price. Douglass later said that learning to read was both a blessing and a curse, because once he understood the world, he could no longer accept his place in it. His mind had become free, even though his body was not. And this is where the story of Frederick Douglass becomes more than history. It becomes a lesson. Douglass understood that mental freedom comes before physical freedom. A person who cannot think freely will always be controlled by someone else. But a person who learns, who thinks, who questions, who understands, becomes dangerous to anyone who tries to control them. Douglass eventually escaped slavery and became one of the greatest speakers and writers of his time. His words were so powerful that people across the country came to hear him speak. But his greatest message was not about anger. It was about self-development. He believed that education, discipline, and character were the tools that transform a human being from powerless to powerful. Frederick Douglass did not start with freedom. He built it, piece by piece, word by word, idea by idea. He built it first in his mind, and then in his life. And that may be the greatest lesson his life teaches us. Before you can change your life, you must first change your mind. Before you can change your circumstances, you must first change yourself. Douglass proved that the most powerful tool a person can possess is not money, not status, not power, but the ability to think, to learn, to understand. Because once a person begins to think for themselves, the world begins to open in ways that were once invisible. Frederick Douglass started life as someone who was not even allowed to read a book. He ended his life as one of the most respected thinkers and writers in the world. His life is proof that the distance between who you are and who you become is built through learning, discipline, and courage. And perhaps the most important lesson from Frederick Douglass is this: they can control a person who does not think, but they cannot control a person who has learned to use their mind. And that is why his story still matters today, because the path he discovered still exists. It begins, as it always has, with learning.